Good evening and welcome to H628. We are today going to discuss the holonomic brain, and that's the discovery of scientist Carl Pribram. And I start with an article called Bergson and the Brain from 1987. And it has to do with the functioning of the brain versus the instantiation of the brain, i.e. the body. Carl Pribram and the scientist David Bohm came to their conclusions at almost simultaneous time, and they are both using the idea of the hologram. A hologram is something that even if it's divided into particles, it is always representing the whole. And one could even say it is the whole. And this has two very important implications that could be good to remember to understand these things. Every little part of the hologram is a smaller variety of the whole. So in one sense, you could say that the little one is representing the whole. Although it's distinct, it's a representation of the whole. It could be its meaning. Its unfoldment or its explicit meaning, whereas the whole is the implicit. The second thing is that the small parts are always coming from the whole, and that the whole is not the sum and a bit more of the little things. Actually, in the theory of David Bohm, as in the theory of quantum physics, as in Julian Barber, the whole doesn't have a little to big relationship with each other. The whole is never an accumulation of the small. And that also goes with mathematics, where you think every number is equal in some way. It's just one more if you go from 5 to 6 and 7 to 6 to 7, 7 to 8. It's time to cut that illusion, and David Bohm might have the best solution, and so does Carl Pribram. And that leads me into the third aspect. So there are third aspects. The third aspects has to do with localization. In the hologram, there is not a point-to-point localization. If you make a hologram, you will make what one calls an impression of reality. And that likeness is in every part and in the whole. and it looks very much like reality. And that means it's not like a photograph or a painting with a central perspective. A point-to-point reference. Instead, it's directly representable. So there is a connection to two aspects here, representationalism and also localization. And that is something that is very important for Karl Pribram. He discovered that things in the brain are not localized. They are not in specific points. They are not photographic representation of reality. But it's rather spread out all over the whole brain. If you would take a real example like the ability to speak French, it's not completely localized in only one part of the brain, but it's sort of spread out. And if you lose one part of this, of the brain, you will lose a little part of the ability. Not a representation of the ability, but the ability as such. So you hear here, both Pribram and David Bohm seem to think that thought is very similar to action. Not a representation, not a point-to-point representation of something else. And thinking is not a representation of intention, and intention is not a representation of the action. You hear what it leads to. So what do we have instead of that? Well, you have something that means something specific, and you have the body, which is the whole and connected to the whole. And that thing that means something, that could be called the thought, an intention. Sometimes nowadays we call it a memory. But it depends a bit. And of course, this has a lot to do with a relationship between the physical and the mental. And psyche comes from the Greek word meaning mind or soul, and soma means the body. And we have this very common expression, psychosomatic. Let's do a little bit of generalization and call soma the material. So when we say psychosomatic, that indicates or suggests some sort of difference in the world. You have matter on one hand, and you have something psychological, something spiritual, the mind. And they are on opposing avenues. So only to have that notion is to introduce a split. And that split causes effects that in its turn sort of, those effects, you could say, are the things that we note for something being real. Yeah, very similar. The split, the fragmentization is exactly what we look for when we want to say that something is real, something is good. And this is a similar but somewhat different way of looking at the mind-body duality, as we commonly see it in Descartes and Bertrand Russell, early Wittgenstein and so forth. What Bergson says is similar to this. The misunderstanding is inbuilt in the process, and the misunderstanding, the split, causes effects, and these effects we mistaken for traits of reality. So in the different avenues of thought, dualism, where we say there is a split, we look for other stuff when we sort of want to confirm it. And that's a very important point to remember. We are not looking for dual objective worldview where people find similar evidence in similar places in the world. The so-called objective reference point. We are looking for something that is almost the opposite, but not really. It's very close to. And how odd it even may sound. This makes a whole lot of difference when we look at both the physical part, the matter part, like you do in physics, and if you look at the other side of polarity, the subject, the mind. And here's the nice stuff. Bohm, at least originally, was physical scientist. So he was looking for the material effects. But Pribram started from the other end. He started from the subject. And somewhere in between they met. And it's a little bit like I suppose it's Mr. Livingstone, where Stanley and Livingstone met each other, although they've been walking from two different paths into the unknown. And they meet each other, and the one chap knows who the other chap is, although they never met, just because of hearsay and the simple fact there is literally nobody out there in the middle of Africa at the time when this happened, which is in itself quite amazing. Those were the two persons to cross Africa completely from coast to coast. Bohm and Pribram did the same thing, and they could also shake hands, which they did eventually, and say, Mr. Pribram, I assume, or Mr. Bohr, I assume. And this being quantum physics, they probably said it simultaneously, because they were already entangled from the beginning. And I say this not completely jokingly, because it is a tad odd that they come out with the same theory almost simultaneously. There's some time lapse, but it's very close to each other. And in both areas they made huge leap. Pribram wrote things, discovered things, theorized about things that just in the last decade been proven or more researched on, more acknowledged. And Burke's Bohm Bohm is the same thing. Many of the things he discovered are now being used as tools in the science of cognition, computer science, and so forth. So we have a little bit of entanglement here. But to start easier off, because Carl H. Prieman, he does not originally write for the layman. That is something Bohm definitely does. Bohm especially pointed towards the layman, and he's unique in that way. He found a method to transfer the mathematical complexities into almost ordinary language, whereas Pribram originally was in his profession, not speaking to other people than his peers, his colleagues. But in these nice articles, which is a bit later, well, not quite a lot later, he brings in Bergson, and one could say that Bergson is a predecessor to some extent. He's very interesting, and I'd say that Bergson is very useful as well. In the book Matter and Memory of Bergson, you will find on page 263, the consciousness is a living being. It's inseparable from its brain in the sense in which a sharp knife is inseparable from its edge. The brain is the sharp edge by which the consciousness cuts into the compact tissue of events. But the brain is no more coextensive with consciousness than the edge is with a knife. What a nice way to put it. In keeping with the zeitgeist of the 19th and early 20th century, Henri Bergson was convinced that understanding the mental and spiritual nature of mankind depended to a large extent on understanding the relationship between man's conscious experience and his brain. What puzzled the intellects of the 19th century was that experience, introspectively analyzed, had so little in common with the physical and biological processes which contemporary science was then describing. Even the behavior of organisms often appear to be controlled by processes resistant to such analysis. Their introspective analysis were therefore reported in what appeared to be speculative, intuitive, and even mystical terms, which seem remote from the precision achieved in scientific discourse. I believe the situation has changed, and that it's most worthwhile to return to the insight achieved by these intellects and to apply the knowledge we gained during the 20th century to the questions they framed so successfully. On this very occasion, it is Bergson who holds the center stage, and I must confess amazement at the richness and precision of thought with which this philosopher foreshadowed what current brain behavior research has demonstrated. Let us begin with and frame other issues within the most complex of these problems, and that of consciousness per se. Bergson has clearly stated the issue that needs to be addressed if the scientific understanding of consciousness is to be achieved. What just is the relationship between consciousness and the brain? The answer to this query is not as simple as Bergson had made it to appear. As we shall see, however, Bergson's intuition does prehend one important aspect of the relationship, an aspect that proves to be most innovative and exciting. To understand consciousness, it's a good start to look at the different states of consciousness. States are separated from one another by phase boundaries. Ice, liquid, water, and steam are free states of H2O, that is water. Sleep, wakefulness, and a hypnotic state appear to be separated by such boundaries, because what is experienced in one state is almost totally inaccessible to another. In a study using hypnotized subject has concluded that different states organizes conscious processes in different configuration, much as different languages organize what we mean to say. There is always some hidden observer who is in some sense knows what is being configured, what is meant. The hidden observer is the state space within which the states develops. So you have a state, and within this state the actual state develops, and underneath that you have an awareness, and that goes from both, well, all of the three different states: wakefulness, sleep, and being hypnotized. And although there are completely different organizations of the whole matter inside, they share in common that there is an awareness underneath the whole thing. So different organizations, but very similar, or actually almost the same observer or observation process going on. So this is what we could call soma significant. You have the body in each state, and you have something that is aware. And there seems to be a relationship between these two aspects, And this relationship is very different from other relationships we stroll upon, because the different relationships seem to affect each other, and they seem to affect a sort of movement. And this movement is a movement that is not similar to other movements, because they both produce the state, the permanent phase, but it also produces the smaller movement, so to speak, the movement within the movement. And this is very similar to what we discussed a couple of lectures ago with the ambigram, that there is a movement in the ambigram, although nothing is moving in the normal sense. And I think I said this proves that there is an underlying movement which is actually more real than ordinary movement, because it's not dependent on some sort of interference. It's always there. It's not localized either. So this makes a sort of movement. So the soma is the body, but it's also the material. It could also be seen as the outside world. And between the material and what observes it, the awareness, there is these things. You have something that hides itself, and you have something that opens up itself. You have an enfolding and you have an unfolding. Invikning respektive utvikning. And you hear in this instance the similarities. I'm using the language of David Bohm here, nota bene, but the similarities are quite astonishing between Karl Pribram and David Bohm here. The idea with the article of Henry Bergson is, of course, to get into the primordial fundamental movement, which Bergson calls élan vital. I might as well write that. The life force, you could call it. And this life force is responsible for all appearance, whether those appearances seem to be moving, seem to be unstable, seem to be passing, or if they are completely stable. I would say direction is a good example of something that is completely stable. A direction does not change. Almost stable is the earth, and so forth. Although this, as I illustrated this, it looks like the movement is going nowhere. But you have to think direction is a more primordial direction, because this movement is ex anteriori, before everything else. And that means that it has the direction going back and the direction going forward at the same time. Or better put, it's what is responsible for that there is a direction, no matter if it's going back or forward. It's primordial even when it comes to direction. So you see, we are speaking of some movement where direction and movement is not yet separated. It's the same thing. To move is to go in a specific direction. And you cannot, as in Newtonian physics, analyze them as two different things, as you do in the coordinate system. You say you have a movement or something, and then you count on the direction. And they seem to be two different things. And I'm going to end here because this is complicated enough. But the first person that questioned the idea that movement and direction are completely separated, as we had been thinking for how many years? 220 years, until Albert Einstein proposed that movement and direction are inseparable. But for 220 years we thought they were separable, and one could say with Einstein we went back to a state that was before Newton, where we always had been thinking that movement and direction are two inseparable things. Although some analyzing went on when you separated them. For instance, when you want to calculate on a cannonball that was shot out of a cannon. But those were, of course, counting examples and pure exceptions to reality. Well, I think I'll round out there, but Karl Pribram is extraordinarily interesting, is very similar to David Bohm. His language is, at least originally, much more complicated than Bohr, because he was originally turning to his peers, his colleagues, but as time passed he took on a much more easier and rounder style of writing and talking, which is quite interesting itself. And I'd say in the end it became somewhat of a harmonious interaction between David Bohm and Pribram, although they were all the time a bit separated, just like the summa significans. Well, I'll continue in the next episode. I said good night for me and wish you a very pleasant evening.